You know that strange feeling when you're laughing at a joke, but a part of you is already scanning the room to see if everyone else is laughing too? When you're about to speak, but another version of you steps back and asks, will this land? Will they approve? Will I look stupid? That's not anxiety. That's not weakness. That's something far more common and far more subtle. It's the quiet habit of living through a mirror that isn't yours. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the hidden self, noticed something most people miss. He saw that there comes a moment in psychological life, not after failure, not after trauma, but simply from exhaustion, when a person grows tired of constantly orienting outward, tired of measuring their heartbeat by the world's clock, tired of asking what do they think, before asking what do I feel. That moment is not a breakdown, it's a signal, a quiet invitation to turn back toward yourself. This video is not about ignoring the world or cutting yourself off from others. It's a slow, deliberate walk, from living under the weight of external eyes to building a life anchored from within. If that title stirred something familiar in you, stay. Because what you've been chasing outside, in validation, in recognition, in the gaze of strangers, may have been waiting for you inside all along. Chapter 1. The Outward Compass. There's a phase almost everyone passes through. Few realize how quietly dangerous it can become. You notice that a compliment lifts your entire day. A silence makes you restless. A single sideways glance, barely intentional, can send you into a spiral of self-doubt for hours. On the surface, everything works. You meet deadlines. You maintain relationships. But internally, something has shifted. Your psychological center no longer lives in your own chest. It has migrated outward, into the hands of anyone who happens to be looking. Jung argued that the moment you measure your worth by external feedback, you lose the deepest anchor of your psychological life. Not because people are cruel, but because you've handed the authority to define yourself to something outside your control. When was the last time you made a meaningful decision without first imagining how it would be received? At that point, your inner life is no longer guided by your own signals. It's governed by collective cues, facial expressions, tones of voice, social benchmarks. You stop asking, is this right for me? And start asking, will this be accepted? Jung didn't see this as a moral failure. He understood the need for recognition as a natural sign of an unfinished developmental stage. When the self isn't firmly established, when you lack a stable internal axis, you're forced to use the external world as a mirror just to know who you are. Not because you're weak, because you don't yet have a strong enough foundation to validate yourself. As Jung wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Imagine walking through a dense forest without a compass. You have no way to know direction, so you watch the crowd. If everyone turns left, you turn left. If most stop, you stop. Not because it's the right path, but because you have no other way to determine direction. Jung called this living by the collective map. You don't truly know where you're going. You only know you don't want to be left behind. And right here, alienation begins. Chapter 2. The Mask You Forgot. Let me ask you something. If you've been living through the eyes of others for years, who has actually been living in your place? According to Jung, it's not another person. It's a psychological structure he called the persona. The social mask you learn to wear from childhood to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid rejection. The persona isn't evil. It's a survival tool. But somewhere along the way, you forget it's just a mask. You start believing the persona is who you actually are. Jung warned that the persona was never meant to carry the weight of your existence. It's a tool, not an identity. When you seek meaning through that mask, a deep misalignment occurs. You no longer live from the inside out. You live to maintain an external image. And the tighter you cling to that image, the further you drift from yourself. The fear of being judged slowly transforms the persona from a tool into a prison. At first, you're just trying to avoid conflict. So you adjust your words, suppress emotions, choose the safe path. But over time, you feel you're no longer allowed to deviate. Every divergent thought creates anxiety. The persona no longer protects you from the world. It protects the world from your true self. Jung wrote with brutal clarity, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." Let that land. When you fully identify with the persona, you begin to live for an image rather than inner truth. And from that distortion emerges a specific addiction. Addiction to recognition. You need praise to feel okay. Positive feedback to believe you're on track. Not because you're shallow, but because you've placed your worth into the mask instead of the self beneath. I once spoke with someone, let's call her Elena, who everyone described as together. Professional. Polished. Always knew what to say, what to post, what image to project. But in a private moment, she admitted something. She no longer knew what she actually enjoyed. Every time she wanted to try something different, she heard internal questions. Will people find this strange? Will they be disappointed? Will they judge me? She wasn't living a bad life, but she'd lived inside the persona so long that she'd lost the feeling of living authentically. Her anxiety didn't come from failure. It came from having nowhere left to take the mask off. Focusing only on yourself, in Jung's sense, doesn't mean rebellion. It means beginning to recognize the difference between persona and self. Daring to see that certain parts of how you live exist only to be accepted, not because they arise from inner truth. And when you begin to loosen that mask, even slightly, what arises? Anxiety. Of course, you're leaving familiar safety. But Jung believed this anxiety isn't a wrong turn. It's a sign you're finally touching something real. Each time you choose not to perform perfectly, something else forms alongside the discomfort. Something lighter, more alive, more yours. You don't need to destroy the persona overnight. Just stop letting the mask govern your inner life. Start listening to your internal response before calculating the external reaction. Allow yourself in small moments to not be recognized in order to preserve inner honesty. If while watching this you realize you've lived very correctly but not truly lived, that may not be a coincidence. Leave a comment, a fragment of that recognition. Sometimes, daring to write it down is the first moment the mask begins to loosen. Chapter 3. The comparison trap. Once you start loosening the persona, an old reflex kicks in. You look sideways. You check if others are moving faster, if they've achieved more, if they're ahead on the invisible timeline society has etched into your mind. Comparison creeps in so quietly you barely notice. A glance at social media, a conversation with an old friend, and suddenly, without deciding to, you're measuring your insides against someone else's outsides. According to Jung, this isn't just insecurity. It's a form of denying your own individual path. Jung insisted no two psychological development processes are identical. Each person carries a unique unconscious structure, a unique rhythm of maturation. But society doesn't operate on that logic. Society creates shared benchmarks. By a certain age, you should have achieved certain things. When you measure your life by collective standards, you stop listening to your own internal process. Jung didn't call this motivation. He called it misdirection. Because every time you look at someone else and conclude, I'm behind, I'm slower, I'm not enough, you're declaring your own path invalid, simply because it doesn't look like someone else's. This is a subtle form of self-betrayal. You're rejecting your unique trajectory in favor of a race you never signed up for. Imagine a runner in a crowded marathon. At the start, he only wanted to reach his own destination. But then he hears footsteps around him, other runners breathing, crowds cheering for those ahead. Without realizing it, he speeds up, changes his pace, abandons his own rhythm, strays from his original route, just to avoid falling behind. Exhausted, he collapses in a place that was never his finish line. Comparison works the same way. When you live inside the race, you spend all your energy on speed, when what you actually need most is direction. I remember a man, let's call him David, who was convinced he'd failed at life. He was in his early 40s. His college friends were partners at firms, founders of companies, homeowners with families. David had changed careers 3 times, moved across the country twice, started projects that never took off. Every reunion left him feeling like he'd missed something essential. But during a difficult period, when life forced him to stop running, he made a quiet discovery. He'd never been lost. He'd simply been walking a different path, slower in social terms, but deeper in inner terms. His process wasn't about accumulation. It was about excavation. When he stopped comparing and began focusing on what actually mattered to him, not what impressed his friends, the heaviness began to lift. Not because he caught up, because he returned to his own rhythm. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become yourself if you're constantly measuring your life against other people's lives. Comparison places you on a timeline that doesn't belong to you. It causes you to misinterpret necessary phases, slowing down, getting lost, even failing, as problems, when Jung understood them as essential ingredients of inner growth. In Greek mythology, Achilles is the greatest warrior, but he's only invincible as long as he follows his own destiny. The moment he seeks validation through other people's definitions of glory, chasing fame, recognition, external proof, he steps outside the protection of fate and falls at his only vulnerable point. Through a Jungian lens, this is the image of a person abandoning their individual path to chase a collective image of success. The price is always high. Focusing only on yourself doesn't mean turning your back on the world. It means stopping the use of other people's lives as the yardstick for your own process. Not having arrived by society's standards doesn't mean you're failing. It may mean you're being prepared for a different kind of maturity. Forgetting others, in the true Jungian sense, means forgetting their timelines. No longer asking, where am I compared to them? And returning to a far more important question, am I aligned with myself? When you focus on that question, the race dissolves, not because you win or lose, but because you realize you were never meant to run in it at all. And precisely when you step out of comparison, your individual path becomes truly visible, clear, alive, just as it has always been. Chapter 4. The Invisible Judge. You've moved past comparison. Stop chasing the collective timeline. But something strange happens next. The fear of being judged doesn't disappear. You're no longer openly competing. But a look, an ambiguous comment, even a long silence, can still make you feel scrutinized, as if an invisible jury watches your every move. According to Jung, this isn't a contradiction. It's a sign you've arrived at a deeper layer, the layer where projection hasn't yet been withdrawn. Jung discovered that most obsessions with being judged don't actually originate in the external world. They originate in unacknowledged parts of your own inner life. He called this projection, unconsciously attributing your own internal material to others. When a feeling is too difficult to accept, the psyche assigns it to someone else. You believe they're thinking about you, judging you, when in reality, it's the voice of your own shadow. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The fear of being judged works the same way. You may believe other people are harsh, critical, unimpressed. But look more closely. Who doesn't allow you to make mistakes? Who whispers that you're not good enough, not fast enough, not correct enough? Very often it's not anyone outside. It's a part of you. The shadow, the repressed aspect of your own psyche. When the shadow isn't acknowledged, it doesn't disappear. It continues to color every interaction, every glance, every comment. Let me tell you about a woman I spoke with. Let's call her Priya. She was constantly worried her colleagues didn't respect her. She felt every question carried hidden doubt. Every piece of feedback was veiled criticism. But when she began to work deeply with herself, through journaling, honest self-inquiry, she realized something startling. Living inside her was a powerful, unspoken belief. I am not good enough. That belief had never been spoken aloud, but it was always present. And because she couldn't accept it as something within herself that needed attention, she unconsciously projected it outward. She believed others were thinking it for her. When she began to confront her own self-doubt, not to eliminate it, but to see it clearly, something unexpected happened. The outside world seemed less judgmental, not because her colleagues changed, because the projection was withdrawn. From modern cognitive science, this makes perfect sense. The brain interprets ambiguous information according to existing beliefs. If you carry a schema of I am easily judged, you become hypersensitive to neutral cues, a pause, a tone shift, a silence, and your brain automatically fills in negative interpretations. Jung described this long before research caught up. The world you fear often mirrors what you haven't yet dared to face within yourself. When you begin to integrate the shadow, allowing yourself to see and dialogue with denied parts, a crucial shift occurs. External voices lose their power, not because you become indifferent, but because you no longer need others to carry your unresolved inner conflicts. You can hear criticism without collapsing, face disagreement without feeling threatened, not because you're armored, but because you've taken responsibility for your own inner world. Focusing only on yourself at this level is no longer about withdrawing from society. It's reclaiming the psychological energy you've unconsciously given away. Every time you worry about being judged, that energy projects outward. When you turn back and ask, which part of me is saying this? You bring that energy back inside. Jung saw this as the transition from living in reaction to the world to living in dialogue with oneself. Forgetting others doesn't mean denying their existence. It means stopping the use of them as mirrors for unresolved inner conflicts. When you no longer need the world to carry what you haven't accepted, the world becomes more neutral, less threatening. And in that silence, a new freedom emerges. When projection is withdrawn, you stop asking who is judging me, and begin asking what within me wants to be seen. If in the final silence you realize you no longer want to ask who is looking at me, but instead what within me is being reflected, leave a word in the comments mirror. Sometimes, simply daring to recognize the mirror is enough for the journey to begin shifting. Chapter 5. The Sacred Space of Solitude. At the moment you stop believing all eyes are on you, life slows down. The noise that once crowded your mind, the constant hum of imagined judgment, anticipated reactions, rehearsed explanations, gradually recedes. And in that settling silence, you begin to touch a state you may have spent years avoiding. Solitude. Not loneliness, not abandonment. Solitude. According to Jung, this isn't a step backward. It's a sign you're moving closer to your inner center. Jung viewed solitude completely differently than the common fear of being alone. For him, solitude wasn't a lack. It was sacred space, the only environment where the soul can finally speak without being drowned out. He wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you. Loneliness comes from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. When you've lived too long under the gaze of others, you rarely hear what's important to yourself. You've been so busy responding to expectations that your own inner voice has become a whisper. Therefore, withdrawing from the crowd isn't escape. It's a necessary condition for inner truth to appear. When you're constantly reacting to the opinions, emotions, and needs of others, the self has no space to coordinate your life. You may function efficiently, but inside, a quiet space remains untouched. And precisely because of fear of that quiet space, people cling to busyness, to constant interaction, to endless distraction, as a way to avoid it. Imagine solitude as a lake in early morning. When wind blows, the surface ripples constantly, reflecting distorted images. You can't see what lies beneath. Only when the wind calms, when the surface becomes still, does the deeper image appear. Psychological life is the same. When you're always surrounded by the voices of others, you only see fleeting, distorted reflections. But when you dare to be alone, no longer reacting, no longer performing, deeper layers of yourself begin to emerge. Silence doesn't create the true voice. It only allows that voice to be heard. There's a well-known story about a creative genius who built an empire and then was pushed out. From the outside, it looked like failure, a public fall, but inwardly, it was a profound withdrawal. He slowed down, traveled, sat in silence, reflected on what actually mattered, beyond fame, beyond recognition. It was during that solitary period that core ideas, which would later define his greatest work, began to take shape. Not in meetings, not in boardrooms, in silence, in solitude, in the space where no one was watching. When he later returned to the world, he was no longer chasing trends or competing for attention. He worked from a clearer inner center. From a Jungian perspective, this is a classic example of solitude becoming the space where the self is restructured. What makes many people afraid of solitude isn't being alone itself. It's what will surface when there's no one left to distract them. In silence, avoided questions appear. True desires, long buried, start to stir. Unnamed sadness, old wounds, inner conflicts once covered by social busyness demand attention. Jung considered this necessary, because only when you dare to stay with these contents do you have the chance to integrate them, rather than continuing to project them outward or numb them with distraction. Focusing only on yourself doesn't mean cutting off relationships. It means temporarily withdrawing attention from others to reestablish inner order. You don't need to disappear from society, but you do need periods of silence deep enough that you're no longer pulled by comparison or judgment. When you're alone without trying to fill the time, without reaching for your phone, without turning on a podcast, you're giving the self the opportunity to coordinate your life again. Forgetting others, here, doesn't mean being antisocial. On the contrary, it's the only way to return to the center. When you no longer need others to validate you or serve as a backdrop for your identity, you stand more firmly in interaction. You don't cling. You don't overreact. You don't lose yourself in relationships. True solitude doesn't distance you from people. It allows you to be more fully present when you return to them, when you can be in silence without panic, when you can be alone without feeling lack. That's a sign the self has begun to take its place in your life. And from that inner foundation, you return to the world not to seek, but to live, not to be seen, but to be present, not to chase anyone, but to walk in alignment with your deepest rhythm. Chapter 6. The Quiet Discipline. According to Jung, there comes a profound turning point. A moment when you stop being pulled outward by the world, and for the first time, build a disciplined inner life. Not the discipline of force, not the discipline of achievement, a different kind. Born from what Jung called inner necessity. Jung never encouraged frantic doing to feel valuable. He distinguished between action driven by the outward-focused ego and action rooted in the inner core. When the outward ego leads, you act to be seen, to be recognized. Your rhythm is dictated by external feedback. Praise speeds you up. Criticism slows you down. Silence throws you into confusion. But when action arises from inner necessity, you act because something inside demands to be realized, even if no one sees, no one praises, no one understands. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. True discipline cannot come from a universal formula. It only appears when you listen to your own rhythm. Imagine a disciplined inner life as a tree, with roots growing deep underground. The roots aren't visible. They aren't impressive. They don't earn compliments. Yet they determine whether the tree withstands storms. If you only focus on feeding the leaves and shaping the canopy to look good, the tree may appear fine until the first storm arrives. Jungian discipline isn't about making your life more impressive. It's about returning, day after day, to nourish those invisible roots. In silence, without an audience. I once worked with a man, let's call him Aaron, who was accustomed to a fast-paced career tied to external recognition, bonuses, titles, performance reviews. He was good at it. But after burnout, he decided to slow down. He didn't launch a dramatic self-improvement plan. He simply began, very quietly, to wake a bit earlier each morning. He'd read, not for productivity, but for depth. He'd write a few lines of reflection, not for anyone to see. He'd identify the single most important thing to focus on that day, and do it before checking emails or social media. No one praised him. No one knew. But Aaron noticed something shifting. He was calmer, clearer in decisions, less swept up by external pressure. He didn't become better than others. He became more aligned with himself. And from that inner anchor, external effectiveness followed as a consequence, not as a goal. From modern science, this has a clear basis. Studies on self-regulation show intrinsic motivation is far more sustainable than extrinsic motivation. When action is driven by rewards or evaluation, the brain quickly fatigues. But when action is tied to personal meaning, the nervous system maintains a more stable state of focus. Jung described this early in the language of depth psychology. Psychic energy flows long-term only when it serves the process of becoming oneself. Focusing only on yourself, at this stage, isn't about turning away from the world. It's establishing a new order of priorities. You invest in yourself, not to surpass others, but to avoid betraying what you know to be true for you. You may do less than others, move slower than others, but each step carries weight. This discipline is often lonely because it doesn't produce a compelling story, no immediate achievements, no applause, and precisely because of that, it remains undisturbed. True growth from Jung's perspective is almost always silent. It doesn't resemble a breakthrough. It's a quiet accumulation, day after day. Each time you do what's necessary without being pushed. Each time you keep your word to yourself in very small matters. And when that inner center becomes solid, you act in the world without being dragged by it. You no longer have to force yourself to try harder, because the energy is already there. You no longer need to prove anything, because the direction is clear. And precisely then you realize a Jungian paradox. The more deeply you focus on yourself, the more steadily you're present in life. Quiet, unshowy, but with weight. This is the discipline no one sees, yet it supports your entire life. If these words touch you in a very calm way, not explosive, but enough to pause and look more deeply at your own rhythm, press like on this video. Not as an external response, but as a small sign that you're choosing to listen to something very real inside. Sometimes, even such a silent gesture is a form of inner discipline. Chapter 7. Withdrawing energy. So what happens when you've built a disciplined inner life, yet still feel as though you're waiting for the world to respond? You're no longer chaotic, no longer chasing comparison, no longer reacting blindly. But somewhere inside, a subtle movement remains, a quiet wish to be acknowledged, to be seen, to receive confirmation that you're on the right path. According to Jung, this isn't a failure. It's the next stage of ego maturation, the moment when energy truly begins to withdraw from the world. When the ego is immature, it needs reflection to know it exists. Praise, attention, positive feedback, these serve as mirrors through which the ego takes shape. A child needs to be seen to develop a sense of self. An adolescent needs validation to build confidence. But Jung believed the ego isn't meant to remain in that state forever. As it matures, it no longer needs the world to constantly tell it that it's okay. It begins to stand on a different foundation. Inner unity. At this point, value no longer comes from how much you have, how many people recognize you, or where you stand socially. It comes from a deep inner sense that what you live, think, and do are not in conflict. Many people confuse focusing on yourself with egoism or withdrawal. But from a Jungian perspective, withdrawing energy from the world isn't turning away from others. It's stopping the use of them as a source of your worth. Because when you still need validation, a portion of your psychic energy is still flowing outward, waiting to be returned as praise or attention. Your emotional life remains externally regulated, even if you appear independent. I remember a woman, let's call her Sarah, who had moved beyond comparison. She wasn't overly afraid of judgment. She had a relatively solid inner life. She worked steadily. She didn't chase an image. But whenever she shared a personal project, something she'd poured herself into, she still unconsciously checked for feedback. Not because she was weak, but because a part of her was still asking, is this good enough to be seen? When she noticed that subtle movement and stopped, not by forcing indifference, but by returning to the inner feeling of the work itself, a quiet shift occurred. She no longer rose or fell with other people's reactions. The work remained the same, but her emotional experience became lighter. She didn't lose motivation. She lost dependence. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." To fully accept yourself means you no longer need anyone to bear witness to your value. This is frightening for an immature ego, accustomed to being nourished by feedback. But for an ego that's done sufficient inner work, this becomes liberation. You no longer need to prove anything, because no part inside still demands reassurance. Imagine psychic energy as a stream of water. When you constantly seek validation, that stream flows outward, spreading across the surface, evaporating in the sun. When you withdraw that energy, it doesn't disappear. It seeps into the ground. It nourishes the roots. No one sees the water underground, but it determines whether the tree survives drought. Inner value is the same. It doesn't need to be displayed, but when it's deep enough, all outward action becomes stable. Emotional independence, in Jungian psychology, doesn't mean needing no one. It means not being shaken by whether others respond. When the self begins to coordinate your life, your emotions no longer rise and fall with external gazes. You can receive praise without excessive excitement, hear criticism without collapse. Not because you're numb, because the center of regulation has shifted from outside to inside. Focusing only on yourself at this point is no longer an effort. It becomes natural. You don't need to try to forget others, because when energy has been withdrawn inward, others naturally lose their influence. You're not concerned with proving you're right. You don't need anyone to confirm you're on the right path. You know, not intellectually, through a deep sense of inner coherence. And this is a very particular moment of psychological maturity, when you realize you're no longer living to be seen, not to be recognized, but not to betray what you know to be true. The world is still there. People are still there. But they no longer hold authority over your inner life. And in that very quiet withdrawal, a rare freedom appears. A freedom that doesn't need to oppose anyone or surpass anyone, because you're no longer standing on the same axis of measurement. When you reach this point, you may realize that focusing only on yourself was never rebellion. nor cold withdrawal. It was a very quiet return. A silent shift of the center of living, from outside to inside. Conclusion: no longer needing the world to confirm who you are. No longer needing other people's gazes as proof of your value. You begin to stand on a different foundation. Inner coherence. From that point, life doesn't necessarily become easier, but it becomes truer. You no longer have to live fast to keep up with anyone. No longer have to live correctly to be accepted. No longer have to live big to be seen. You only need to live in alignment with what's moving most deeply within you. And paradoxically, it's precisely when you stop seeking your place in the world that the world no longer has the power to shake you. If this video made you pause, or touched a very familiar feeling you've never named, share it with someone who's also tired of living under other people's eyes. And if you want to continue the journey inward, subscribe, not to become a better version for the world, but to no longer lose yourself within it.